Last but far from least is our panel focusing on Taiwan and Korea. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists and turn it over to them. Our first speaker will be Richard Bush, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's formerly Chairman and Managing Director of the American Institute in Taiwan, a prolific author on Taiwan, Cross-Strait, China, and recently Japan issues as well. He's the author, among other works, of Untying the Knot, Making Peace in the Taiwan Strait, and the recent Perils of Proximity, China-Japan Security Relations. Our second paper giver will be Victor Cha, who's Senior Advisor and inaugural holder of the newly created Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Director for Asian Affairs. He was Director of Asian Affairs at the National Security Council under the previous administration, and was U.S. Deputy Head of the Delegation to the Six-Party Talks. He's also the D.C. Soong Professor of Government and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. He, too, is a prolific author in the relevant fields, including Nuclear North Korea, a debate on engagement strategies with David Kyung, who was our presenter last year at our conference. So we've got both halves of that collaboration here. And Alignment Despite Antagonism, U.S. Korea Japan Security Triangle. Our two commentators will be Vincent Wang, who is Chair of the Political Science Department and Professor of Political Science at the University of Richmond, and writes quite extensively on China and international relations and cross-strait relations in particular. And last again, but far from least, is Professor Kyung Leem, who is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Seoul National University and a visiting scholar at the Center for East Asian Studies this year at the University of Pennsylvania. He writes in a number of areas, including Russia and South Korea relations. So without further ado, let me pass the podium along to Richard Bush.
Thank you very much, Jacques. I appreciate being invited by FPRI and the Reserve Officers Association to speak this afternoon, but I just set myself a new rule. Never, never, never accept an invitation to speak right after Aaron Friedberg. What I'd like to do today is 5 things. First of all, describe briefly the essential character of cross-strait relations before President Ma Ying-jeou came to office in May of 2008. Second, review what's happened in the last 30 months. Third, clarify what I believe this process represents and what it does not represent. Fourth, examine in a speculative way what might happen in the future, and then lastly discuss, again speculatively, the implications of those different scenarios for East Asian security and the United States. Why is this important? To pick up on a couple of themes of Aaron's presentation, first of all, I happen to think that how China deals with the Taiwan issue will be a litmus test of what kind of great power it's going to be. Second, there are obvious implications for others in Asia. The Japanese, some Japanese at least, are worried that unification is coming. It will mean that the PLA will be on Taiwan, and there go the security of the sea lanes of communication. So, first topic, what was going on before 2008? Previously, there had been about 15 years of deterioration in relations between China and Taiwan. That occurred despite growing economic interdependence. There had been some hopes in the early 1990s of political reconciliation, but the two sides could not overcome a series of misunderstandings and true differences over their expectations and objectives. Politics in both China and Taiwan aggravated those problems. Increasingly, each side feared that the other was going to challenge its fundamental interests. Beijing feared that Taipei would close the door on its goal of unification. Taipei feared that Beijing would constrain it to a point that negotiations on China's terms would be inevitable. I don't necessarily believe that these fears were accurate, but what people believed was what was operative. So each side took measures to protect its interests. Taiwan asserted its claim of sovereignty and sought to expand its international space. Beijing built up its military capabilities and imposed a diplomatic quarantine on Taipei. These reactions to fears only deepened suspicions. So we have a deepening spiral of mutual fear that played out in a series of episodes which led Washington to worry that the two sides would ignore its appeals for restraint and miscalculate themselves into a conflict. That, in turn, might entrap the United States in a war with China. So, for more than a decade before May 2004, a corrosive political dynamic dominated by deepening mutual suspicion and aggravated by misperceptions and politics drove cross-strait relations. Since 2008, we've seen an attenuation of this dangerous situation. Since Ma took office in May 2008, the two sides have undertaken a systematic effort to improve their relations, reduce the level of mutual fear, and reverse the previous negative spiral. They've made significant progress on the economic side, removing obstacles and facilitating broader cooperation. They've signed 14 agreements in about 2 years, the most notable one being the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA, signed on May 29th. That is the foundation of a free trade area between Taiwan and the mainland. There has been less progress on the political and security side, but that is partly by design. I think by now Beijing and Taipei understand that the necessary mutual trust and consensus on key conceptual issues are lacking. So the two sides have chosen to work from easy issues to hard ones, thereby deferring discussion of sensitive issues like a peace accord, for example. In addition, it has become clear that broad support does not yet exist among Taiwan voters for agreements on these political and security matters. Beijing understands that it has an interest in keeping President Ma and the KMT in power, so it is not currently pushing its larger agenda. One reason for the progress that has occurred is that the Ma and Hu administrations have each avoided imposing hard preconditions before they're prepared to engage in dialogue and to negotiate agreements. They have relied on the so-called 1992 consensus as the basis of negotiating economic functional issues, even though there are limits to that consensus. The two sides have also tacitly agreed not to raid each other's diplomatic partners. So in the last 30 months, one can say a rather virtuous circle has replaced what had become a vicious circle. There are, of course, forces in China who think that progress isn't occurring fast enough. The DPP on Taiwan believes that the process is going too fast. So far, both Hu Jintao and Ma Ying-jeou seem to have gotten the better of the argument with their critics, and they understand they've embarked on a long-term process. These developments, I think, have been a great boon to the United States, given its interests in peace and stability in East Asia. And Washington, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, have endorsed the progress that has occurred. That removes one headache for an America that has far too many headaches as it is. Despite this progress, there are some reasons for concern. First of all, Beijing has been cautious in acceding to Taiwan's desire for greater international space. Second, it is not clear that the 1992 consensus, which has facilitated progress so far, will be enough of a basis for China when it comes to political and security matters. Beijing may want Taiwan to endorse the One China principle. Most worrisome is the situation on the security front. The PLA's acquisition of capabilities relevant to Taiwan continues without any reduction. Deployments of advanced assets opposite the island have not eased, and the military balance is shifting in China's favor. As a result, Beijing's mixed policy runs the risk of creating suboptimal outcomes. A continuing military buildup intensifies the Ma administration's desire for closer security cooperation with the United States, which the PRC opposes. Beijing's reluctance to be flexible on international space undercuts its basic goal of winning the hearts and minds of the Taiwan public. So to move to my third point, what is the character of the current process? The big question on the minds of many in China, Taiwan, the United States, Japan, and other places is where this is leading. Many in China expect that the ultimate outcome will be unification of the island with China. Some in Taiwan, Japan, and the United States worry that it will result in Taiwan's submission to the PRC. The majority in Taiwan believes that the status quo can go on indefinitely. I think here it's useful to distinguish conceptually between what I personally think is going on, what I call the stabilization of cross-strait relations, and resolution of the fundamental dispute between the two sides. Obviously, stabilization can feed into a resolution of the fundamental dispute, but not necessarily the case. The fundamental dispute has existed since 1949, but it's taken different forms. Since the early 1980s, I think the argument has been over whether the geographic territory of Taiwan will be part of the Chinese state, and if so, how? What are the terms and conditions? Ultimately, it's an argument over the existence and nature of the Republic of China. I happen to believe that there are significant substantive and political obstacles to resolving the fundamental cross-strait dispute in any foreseeable future, perhaps in my lifetime. Taiwan rejects the PRC's one country, two systems formula for resolution because it would deny its claim of sovereignty, and a declining share of the public supports unification. Theoretically, there are approaches which would reconcile China's desire for unification and Taiwan's claim of sovereignty, but these have been a non-starter with Beijing. In my view, what has happened since May 2008 is not an ineluctable rush to unification, but what I call stabilization. It's an improvement over the conflicted coexistence and tense status quo that previously prevailed, but it is not a wholesale transformation of that status quo. Stabilization has turned the negative spiral of the years before 2008 into a fairly positive one, and it has led to a decline in mutual mistrust that has allowed cooperation to occur. Stabilization includes several elements, I think. First of all, it requires a firm basis on which the two sides can confidently engage each other. So far, that's been the 1992 consensus. Second, stabilization expands the areas of cooperation in various fields, which builds constituencies and political support on each side of the strait. Third, stabilization can take an institutionalized form. For example, ECFA calls for the creation of a cross-strait economic cooperation committee. Fourth, stabilization has occurred incrementally, thus building mutual trust and maintaining a minimum level of political support. So we have stabilization on the one hand, the resolution of the fundamental dispute on the other. I would like now to identify more precisely, but speculatively, different directions in which the current cross-strait situation might evolve. And I present 5 scenarios. Scenario building is what people in Washington do. The first scenario is that the current positive trend of stabilization continues with declining tensions, greater mutual confidence, more agreements, institutionalization of relations, and so on. But the key obstacles to unification remain in place in the medium term. The two sides do understand that stabilization is important for its own sake, not least because it creates a better environment for addressing more fundamental issues in the longer term. In the second scenario, the current process of stabilization stalls before a fully institutionalized and cooperative order is created. Economic interdependence would continue to deepen, but the two sides are unable to reach understandings on political and security issues. Also, China might be willing to exert more leverage to exploit Taiwan's weakness, and some degree of mutual mistrust persists. Public support in Taiwan for reconciliation would decline, and the Taiwan government, either a KMT government or a DPP government, would adopt a more Taiwan-first stance to stay in power. The third scenario is that the DPP returns to power and resumes what China perceives as a provocative approach. This DPP government wouldn't necessarily take explicit steps towards de jure independence, but it would engage in more symbolic gestures that lead Beijing to see the start of a more insidious, incremental, and gradual effort, one that would look very much like what it believes happened from 2000 to 2008. Fourth, the stabilization of cross-strait relations might unexpectedly morph for change into movement towards resolution of the fundamental dispute. This could happen in various ways. Either Beijing might concede or Taipei might concede, but stabilization would lead to resolution. The fifth scenario is that at some point in time, China loses patience with Taiwan's preference for a divided status quo and uses military power and other pressure to try to compel Taipei to negotiate on Beijing's terms. Under this scenario, the PLA's growing capabilities, a frustration with Taiwan's preference for the status quo, and the belief that the island could be a strategic outpost would lead China to act. Those are the scenarios. What are the probabilities that any one of them might occur? It's very hard to say. My own guess is that either of the first two is the most likely, either a continuation of the current process or a stalemate. A number of factors will, of course, influence these probabilities, but three stand out. The first is politics on Taiwan. The second is how the two sides address the key divisive issues of sovereignty and security. Third is the issue of how Beijing seeks to exercise its growing leverage and how Taiwan responds. So, moving to the fourth topic, implications for the United States. Continuation of stabilization is positive for U.S. interests. It reduces further the likelihood that cross-strait relations will be a security problem for us. If, however, stabilization were to stall, I don't think it's terrible for the United States. It neither requires a return to the exercise of dual deterrence in the 1995-2008 period, nor does it necessitate a shift away from the way we have interacted with Beijing or Taipei. It does raise the prospect that the PLA buildup will continue, rendering Taiwan more vulnerable and making it easier for Beijing to pressure the island. A DPP return to power and to provocative policies, the third scenario, is not a good outcome for Washington, which has sought to have good relations with both sides of the strait. We would then have to choose between them and maintain a delicate balance between our warnings to each side and our reassurances towards each. And because China's relative power has grown, it might be less willing to heed U.S. warnings. Movement towards unification, the fourth scenario, might well pose serious challenges to American interests. Of course, the terms of unification would be the key. If China did concede to Taiwan on the sovereignty issue, that would say something significant and positive, I think, about what kind of major power it's becoming. That's not a bad outcome. If unification did not result in the permanent basing of PLA air and naval forces on Taiwan, as some PRC leaders have suggested in the past, the security implications for the United States would be modest. If, on the other hand, Taiwan accepted both political unification and a PLA presence, the consequences for our security position in Asia are more severe. The possibility that Beijing would lose patience within the context of a shifting military balance would pose, obviously, a serious challenge to the United States, which has long been the provider of security public goods in East Asia. It would represent a failure of the long-term American strategy to shape China into a constructive member of the international community. So we have 5 scenarios, 5 sets of implications, and these suggest 5 different policy responses. If Beijing and Taipei can continue the current positive process at a pace that the Taiwan public can accept, then Washington has the comfortable option of confining itself to supporting that process and doing what it can to create a context for it to persist. One issue is what balance to strike between its relations with Beijing and its ties with Taipei, but that could probably be worked out. If the process stagnates, there are many things that the United States might do quietly to foster movement. It might offer, quote, intellectual facilitation, unquote, to remove the reasons for the stalemate. It would have to determine which of the 2 parties is deemed more responsible for the stagnation. If, third, the DPP returns to power and returns to provocations of China, the United States would have to seriously consider reverting to the dual deterrence mode of the 1995-2008 period. This would likely prove more challenging than it was during that time because China's relative military power has grown. If the current process begins to accelerate to unification and does so on terms that allowed China to project military power from Taiwan or threaten freedom of navigation, Washington would, I think, have to consider quietly shaping the negotiations, and most likely by trying to work with our Taiwan friends. If unification resulted in the PLA's deployment to the island, Washington would face the challenge of fundamentally adjusting U.S. security policy in Asia and the Pacific. Finally, if China chose to coerce Taiwan, the United States would face the choice of meeting that challenge or standing down, and that has broader regional implications, obviously. So my review of the past and speculations about the future yield different potential scenarios and different implications. I think predicting what will happen is very difficult because of the complexities of each actor and their interactions, the speed with which China accumulates power that's relevant to Taiwan, and how it chooses to use that power is obviously critical. Whether the United States has both the will and the ability to provide security public goods for East Asia in general and the Taiwan Strait in particular is also critical. But I think Taiwan's own trajectory is also important, for it will shape Taiwan's own ability to address the challenge of China. Here I must say that the demographic, economic, social, and budgetary trends are not particularly favorable. There's a similarity to Japan's situation. And this creates a dilemma on how to achieve the competing goals of economic prosperity, human welfare, and external security. Taiwan could try to muddle through those choices, but I think that is suboptimal and makes it harder to deal with the challenge of China. The alternative is to engage in a proactive program of self-strengthening economically, diplomatically, militarily, politically, and ultimately psychologically. Whether Taiwan has the leadership to undertake that effort is another question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. And let's move on to our next presenter.
Okay.
Terrific, balanced, and thorough presentation.
Well, thank you, Jacques. It's a pleasure to be here at the Reserve Officers Association and with FPRI. I apologize for missing the earlier sessions. I was at a different set of meetings with some private sector and financial groups where they were asking lots of questions about the change, quote, in North Korea, and what the political change in the North meant, and whether that spun out all these scenarios for economic reform and with a young and new enlightened leadership. And I had to say that while the lunch was good, I finally got to a point where I had to say, this economic reform thing, in my humble opinion, is really a pipe dream. And that if you really want to talk about political change, it's actually happening around North Korea. It's not happening in North Korea. And what I meant by that was that, and as I'll talk about, I think there is much more talk about unification these days in and around the Korean Peninsula than there ever has been in the last 10 years. And I think there are basically three developments that have led people to do this more. The first and obvious, of course, is that Kim Jong-il is very sick. Complications from his stroke in 2008 appear present, and his desired succession of power to his youngest son is a far more shaky power transition than the one that put the father in power in 1994. Second, I think there's more talk about unification now than in the past because of a growing realization that 2 decades of U.S. negotiation with North Korea has not led to successful denuclearization. I think in the past many would have contested this proposition and blamed the United States as much as they would have blamed North Korea. But after the Obama administration's efforts early in their term to reach out to the North, and that being responded to with missile tests, nuclear tests, and then the sinking of the Cheonan, I think has created a growing realization that true, verifiable denuclearization can only come with unification. This is not an argument for regime collapse, and it's not an argument against diplomacy. It's simply a realization that the security threats that we face from the North are not likely to be resolved through negotiation, and they're only likely to be fully resolved through unification. Third, I think the new and future leadership in North Korea is not capable of reform. We saw in September the youngest son being put in a position where he will almost assuredly be named the successor to his father by his rank now in the army and his rank in the party. And as we've seen from some of the press reports about him, he appears to be more worldly in the sense that he has apparently spent some time studying in Switzerland, speaks some English, apparently, likes Western things. DPRK propaganda calls him a brilliant genius, wise beyond his years with high-tech 21st century knowledge. So, we have to ask the question. On occasion in world histories, you have had leaders, courageous leaders who have brought about monumental change, and we are required to ask the question whether the youngest Kim has this capacity to do this. In my view, rather than trying to figure out or psychoanalyze the youngest Kim, because we don't know anything about him, I think we have a pretty good sense of the obstacles that he would face, even if he were. Even if we took the huge leap of faith and assumed that he had some sort of enlightened capabilities, there are just too many obstacles that stand in the way of real reform in North Korea. The first is that regimes like North Korea cannot survive without the ideology to justify their grip on power. And the ideology that accompanies the youngest son's rise, Kim Jong-un's rise, appears to look backwards rather than looking forward. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago where I called this, because we academics have to have a name for everything, I called this neo-Juche revivalism, which constitutes a return to sort of the conservative and hardline Juche, or self-reliance ideology, of the 1950s and 1960s, which is a day when the North was actually doing better than the South and was seen to be successful. This neo-Juche revivalism is laced with military-first ideology, which features, among other things, the North's emergence as a nuclear weapon state, which is about the only contribution that Kim Jong-il can claim to have made for the state during his time in power. Perhaps most important, or for the question of reform, this revivalist ideology really leaves no room for reform because it basically blames the poor performance of the state over the past decade on experimentation with reform. So these things all created ideological and spiritual pollution, which has caused the problems in North Korea rather than helped to solve them. True reform in a post-Kim Jong-il era would require the courage to loosen the very political instruments of control that have allowed the regime to maintain its iron grip. This is a dilemma that I think the young Kim faces, and I wrote about it in Foreign Affairs, I don't know, about 8 years ago with regard to the Kim Jong-il. And the dilemma is that they obviously need to open up to survive, but the process of opening up can lead to the collapse of the regime. And Kim Jong-il could not find a solution to that dilemma, and his son, I don't think, can find a solution to that dilemma. And then thirdly, even if Kim Jong-un were an enlightened leader who had the courage to attempt reform, he would be dealing with a generation of institutions and people in North Korea that are arguably the most isolated in North Korean history. People forget, we thought Kim Il-sung was bad, but people forget that during the Kim Il-sung era, the Cold War era, the generals, the party people, the bureaucrats were far more worldly. They could travel to different parts of the Eastern Bloc. Kim Il-sung was good friends with Erich Honecker and Nicolae Ceausescu, as we learned from the archives that have been recently released from the Wilson Center. By contrast, Kim Jong-il's generation saw Ceausescu get executed, right? And perhaps more importantly, they saw the Chinese Communist Party almost lose control in Tiananmen Square. So this generation of leadership sees nothing comforting about the outside world. Of course, this neo-Chuche revivalism is untenable in the long term. Mass mobilization of workers without reform can only work with massive inputs of food, fuel, and equipment, which the Chinese increasingly will be relied on. They are being relied on, and increasingly will be relied on to provide. Right now, Beijing seems content to backstop this regime. We can discuss for how long into the future they would be willing to do this, but sooner or later, it's going to have to become an untenable situation. So this is why I think people are talking more about unification today than they have been in the past. And I think while there's more talk about unification today, the question then becomes, is there a strategy? Is there an idea? Is there a plan for how they're thinking about unification? Historically, when you talked about unification in Korea, it basically meant one of two things. Right? The first concept was the concept during the Cold War, which was unification by victory. Right? It was one side would win over the other side. This was known as March North, or Songgong Tongyil in Korean, the notion of unification by force. That was the only way that unification was thought of. The other way that it was thought of in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Germany was the notion of unification not by force but by absorption, that the South Koreans would be able to have the economic wherewithal to absorb or swallow up the North. And that was a view that was held for a few years, but then quickly disappeared in the mid to late 1990s for two reasons. One was they actually studied the German example and saw that it wasn't that easy. And then second was the Asian financial crisis in 1997, which imposed very harsh resource constraints on Korean views of unification. And then the third concept that we all became very familiar with over the past 10 years was the notion that unification, the concept was basically unification was just too difficult. It was too expensive. It was too dangerous. And therefore, we should push this off for as long as we can, right? And hope eventually for a soft landing, right? And this view of unification was basically what informed the Sunshine Policy, right? The notion of engaging with North Korea and trying to narrow the gap so that eventually, 2 or 3 generations from now, there could be some sort of gradual process of unity. So what is the current discourse that I described about unification about? And it's difficult to sort of explain it in a soundbite, but I think there are basically 4 things that distinguish the new view, if you will, on unification than the view that we've seen in the past. The first is that this new discourse is based more in pragmatism than it is based in ideology. In other words, the embracing of unification does not stem from some sort of ideological desire to subvert the regime, but simply stems from the pragmatic concerns about the potential instability of the leadership in Pyongyang, and also from the pragmatic realization that negotiations just have not solved this problem. Right? It solves it temporarily, but then the problem comes back again and again, as it has in 1994. And then in the aftermath of the 2005 agreement. Second, this new discourse on unification is more internationalist and transparent and open in nature. And what I mean by that is that in the past, if you ever tried to engage with a Korean on unification, you get sort of the pushback, right? They'd say, this is not, I'm essentially saying that this is a Korean thing, right? Unification must be handled by Koreans. We want no external interference or intervention. This is our problem. This is our issue. We don't need great powers or others involved in it. But I think what's happening now is that the new view, while it certainly understands that unification is for Koreans, there is again an acknowledgement, a pragmatic acknowledgement that Koreans will indeed need help from the outside world to effect a successful unification process. So the attitudes now are very open about unification, and there have been a series of conferences that have taken place in Korea where it's very clear who they invite to these things. I mean, they make sure to invite high-level American statesmen like Colin Powell and Bill Cohen and others, but they also invite people from the P5 countries to participate. They're clearly trying to reach out to the world and talk about unification because they want the world to understand the way South Koreans view unification. They really want to try to socialize the world about the way South Koreans think about unification so that when the day comes, others around the world would see it the way they see it. This socialization process, I think, also extends to Korea's younger generations in their 20s and 30s. This younger generation, as we all know, in Korea is younger, they're smarter, they're more affluent, but at the same time they grew up under 1 decade of Sunshine Policy, 1 decade of thinking about Sunshine Policy. And therefore, any views that they hold on unification will probably tend to be more negative. Now I think this younger generation is being encouraged to think, prepare, and talk about unification in a way that was discouraged during the past 10 years. Third, I think this new unification discourse is based in ideas more than it is about power. What I described before, unification by force, the original conception of unification, was very much about power and relative power, who was stronger. But I think the new view says that what it will eventually bring unification is not use of force, but the power and prevalence of ideas. These ideas, as we all know, relate to freedom, democracy, individual opportunity, the entitlement to human dignity. And once these views, or notions, or ideas start seeping into North Korean society, the game is basically over. Finally, I think this new discourse on unification is about opportunity more than it is about threats. The previous view, as I mentioned, saw unification as being too expensive and too dangerous. Unification was therefore a threat to Koreans, to the lifestyles of Koreans, and to the region. It was threatening to everybody. But this new view now expounds unification as an opportunity, and perhaps the greatest opportunity in the post-war era for Koreans and for East Asia. Properly prepared for unification, it could become the biggest positive-sum game in Asia for all parties. So this is a very positive and proactive view of unification, not a defensive and negative view. The last thing I would say is that this discourse on unification that I describe is not naive. It harbors no false expectations that unification somehow has become an easier task. I believe everybody understands how difficult the task will be. It is not likely, unification is not likely to come about gradually, as sunshine policy advocates have wished for. It is likely to come suddenly. If you look at the history of the Korean Peninsula, nothing happens gradually. Whether it's war, democratization, nothing happens gradually. But I think the view now is that Koreans will have to prepare to meet this challenge, and they will have substantial support and help from their allies, including the United States. But they will also need a little bit of luck. And if one looks at Korean history, luck is not a trait that has been in abundance. In spite of this, Korea has done very well. And as one person said in these conversations that we're having in Seoul, you can only be lucky if you are prepared, right? You never have luck if you are not prepared. And that's why I think Koreans are hoping for a little bit of luck, but also they are preparing and thinking proactively about unification in a way that they haven't for the past 10 years. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. A nice pair of presentations. They're addressing some really quite similar themes despite the different contexts. Let me pass it along to our commentators. I'll go with Vincent Wang first.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Reserve Officer Association for giving me an opportunity to be in the good company of these very astute observers of Asian politics. To be a commentator of Dr. Richard Bush's paper is a tall order. I cannot think of a lot more people who have written on the subject in a more intelligent manner. But I'm assigned as a discussant, so I nonetheless
Go for it.
Okay. I think I like to. For the most part, I agree with Dr. Bush. I also have some questions. I'd like to begin with two puzzles, maybe. One is that on page 5, Dr. Bush nicely put, which I think is also very interesting. To be sure, China's approach on Taiwan is an exception to its rather stunning record over the last year or so of alienating most of the actors on its periphery, South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asian countries, and India. This morning, we spent a lot of time talking about how, in the last 2 years, China has become more assertive and so on. And the shining exception to this is China's very careful attitude toward the new situation in the Taiwan Strait. So Richard mentioned how China treats Taiwan can be a litmus test to the kind of great power China has to become. Well, this reminds me of a totally opposite discourse barely 10 years ago. That is when China was proclaiming its policy of peaceful rise or peaceful development, and then people point out that they're pretty aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan. They would say, Taiwan is sui generis. So you cannot have sui generis and the litmus test at the same time. Okay, so at that time, China was peaceful toward everybody, but with 3 exceptions toward the United States, Japan, and Taiwan. And now China is at odds with all its neighbors, except that this newfound tranquility across the Taiwan Strait is too precious. So I thought that was a puzzle, but it's a good one for the Americans because, as Richard mentioned, that for about 15 years, Americans were worried about whether the U.S. might be dragged into a war with China over Taiwan. A second puzzle emanating from Richard's paper is that while most Americans are understandably quite pleased with the reduction of tension and notable reconciliation between Taiwan and China. But the U.S. somehow curiously stand on the sideline. If my metaphor is that you have a scale, that on one side, the Chinese side, they obviously have so focused on maintaining good relations with Taiwan that they are willing to let its behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan as a sui generis, and then that the United States basically, in my opinion, maybe Richard knows more than I do. I have no reasons to doubt that is the case because of his experience and his wide connection in the government. But from my standpoint, I feel that the U.S. is actually on an autopilot. Yes, the current Ma administration is not creating problems for the U.S., but perhaps it's too cooperative. That I can cite some indicators. Earlier, Professor Pempo gave quantitative evidence about the declining share of U.S. markets of all the Asian countries. In my own research, in 1980s, 40% of Taiwanese exports ended up in the U.S. Today, it's 42% on the mainland, and about only 11%, 12% are on the U.S. So what we see is that this U.S. Basically standing on the sideline while China's influence in the region through trade and through other means is growing. And this balance on the scale, I'm afraid, I'm puzzled, at least. It's a little bit unbalanced. So much in autopilot that the only thing you heard about the U.S.-Taiwanese relations in the last year was the beef issue. Although I think people in this town would rather not talk about it. But, when the two fundamentally, good friends, especially when you have a new administration that is not causing trouble for you, the only thing you can talk about is beef. Then I think this relationship really needs management and cultivation. It has been on autopilot for too long. So that's a puzzle. I'd like to hear what Richard say. Richard's description of the dual deterrence policy from I believe you mean 1995 to 2008, because you cannot have 15 and then 1995. The dual deterrence consists of both warnings and reassurances to both Beijing and Taipei. I think this is correct, but maybe for the benefit of the readers, you can spell out what those are a little bit. And your description about the Beijing and Taipei's approach toward cross-strait reconciliation, starting from the economic and functional issues, and trying to move toward political security and diplomatic issues, is probably also correct. Here I have a question, because it's largely by design. It is true. But on the economic and functional issues, Beijing seems to be willing to accept the so-called 92 consensus. Of course, a lot of ink has been spent on what exactly that consensus is, or whether there is a consensus, because the way that Beijing sees it is that it's a one China. It's a one China principle. Although during the stage of negotiating economic and functional issues, the two sides do not need to spell out the exact meaning of the one China. So in other words, 各表一中, whereas the KMT's position is 一中各表. It's one China. Each side have its own interpretation. Although for the KMT it means the Republic of China, and the mainland Chinese are willing to paper over this. So you have this sort of agree to disagree framework that allows the economic functional issues to proceed. But my question is, the Chinese on the mainland have stated that to proceed to the political, security, and diplomatic issues, it has to be done under the one China principle, or one China precondition. 在一中的前提之下，什么都可以谈. So whether Beijing will be willing to move from one version, some kind of version, a variation of some 92 consensus, to this high-level, more difficult negotiation, or will insist on the Taipei accepting Beijing's version of one China. So that we can actually have three different scenarios. I learned a few things from Richard. One is this playing scenario. One, of course, is that this neo-functional approach may actually mimic the West European experience, namely, spill over to the political security area. And two is that when the second scenario is actually when Beijing presses very hard, that this actually may create friction. So ironically, issues that should be of mutual interest, such as economic interdependence, might actually become a source of friction. Okay, this possibility cannot be discounted. And third is that while it is understandable that Beijing wants all these gradual rapprochement leading to a final outcome, it is not clear what Taipei wants from this. So it could be gradualism to nowhere. Right? But how long Beijing is willing to tolerate this gradualism to nowhere remains to be seen. I will be curious to hear your view on the ECFA. I heard one version of ECFA is that it is not only an economic agreement, but also a political reassurance. Basically, Taipei is saying to Beijing that it is making at least the road of de jure independence less possible. I was wondering if you can read a lot of political significance to that. Stabilization, you described the current process as stabilization. I think you're right. And it has to be distinguished from the resolution of a fundamental dispute. But I was curious about just how enduring, how stable, how strong the stabilization process is. Can it be disrupted by some unforeseen circumstances? Would you consider, now that the KMT government has no interest in declaring de jure independence, would it be a good time to consider or resurrect the idea of interim agreement floated by some former government officials and scholars, namely Taiwan does not declare independence for 50 years, or maybe 100 years, and China does not use force for the same amount of time, and that the two sides will try to reach some kind of a political settlement. I wonder if that will actually help strengthen or consolidate the stabilization you're talking about. You're also right to talk about the U.S. policy has emphasized more on process than outcomes. You asked a good question, whether it is time for the U.S. to begin wondering about what the different outcomes might mean to the United States. I was curious about how you assign those probabilities, 35, 35, 25, 5. But I think it's very helpful, at least to analytical help the readers to contemplate just exactly what kind of implications are each scenario is for Americans. I just have obviously some logical question. For instance, you hypothesize that if the DPP come back to power in 2012 and decides to provoke the U.S. again, it will be bad outcome for the United States. Although this is low probability, you assign 5%. What if, I know that the DPP has not gone through the kind of a policy debate that it did in 1999, but what if this is a DPP that becomes rational, a DPP that does not provoke China? What if the DPP accept essentially the same version as the KMT does? What kind of implication would this pose for the United States? Would that be a good or bad outcome? You also mentioned that if a cross-strait reconciliation continues, that perhaps U.S. arms sales to Taiwan needs to be recalibrated. But I wonder if this actually poses some kind of a dilemma for Taiwan, because the Chinese obviously want to convince the Taiwanese, hey, the best source of security for you is actually to link some kind of agreement with me. You don't need no amount of U.S. weapons can guarantee your security. So, and then your argument seemed to logically actually reinforce that kind of reasoning that, if Taiwan wants to maintain some kind of autonomy, it's actually better to live off some kind of tension with China, because if it's a totally smooth process, the arms sales from the United States might actually be reduced. So this is a dilemma for Taiwan, I can see. And finally, you argue that your paper actually talked very little about the resolution of the fundamental dispute, which of course we know it's very difficult and perhaps not happening in a long time. And you're also quite right to say that up to this point, the two sides have acted mostly out of fear rather than hope. I'm an optimist. My wife always said I'm too optimistic. So I like to think what kind of a final resolution based on hope might look like. The Chinese have ruled out a confederation. They say that there's no historical precedent in Chinese history. Well, there's no historical precedent for one country, two systems either. So I wonder if confederation might be actually the best outcome for China if they have to, come to think of it again. Thank you.
Thank you for that set of comments and questions. Give us a lot to chew on in a few minutes. But first, our final speaker on this panel.
I found today that you look so serious today, both paper presenters and audience. Probably you are more serious than East Asians themselves, I think. But actually, I have been spending my sabbatical year in Pennsylvania quite peacefully. But today, I find myself in the middle of the turmoil, the most serious turmoil in the world. But still, I appreciate your kind invitation. It's certainly my honor to be here, and I'm learning a lot from prominent scholars here. Given the tight time constraint, I'd like to read my prepared comments. To summarize my comments first, I agree with Professor Cha on the question about the reformability of the North Korean system. But I'm hesitating, jumping from this pessimism to optimistic scenarios or forecasting regarding the unification issues. Let me quickly introduce my perception going backward to the 50s or 60s a little bit. To remind you the backbone of the North Korean system, to forecast this future. I mean here, Su-ryong-jae, that is the great leader system of North Korea. About 5 years ago, I adopted Professor Ken Jawi's concept of neo-traditionalism and defined the Su-ryong-jae as an extreme case of neo-traditionalism. I did this because since mid-1990s, some scholars, it was quite popular, some scholars in Seoul have explained or even rationalized the emergence of Su-ryong-jae as a socialist developmental or modernization strategy. One of its implications was that in the 90s, the North Korean system could be reformed depending on its new economic needs. At the time, I refuted that argument. If we examine the political history of North Korea in 50s and 60s more carefully, we can find not the economic factors, but political and geopolitical factors did matter much more in the evolution of the Su-ryong-jae. It was end result of Kim Il-sung's struggle with other factions who had close connections with either the Soviet Union or China. So in a sense, Su-ryong-jae was the consequence of Kim Il-sung's leadership consolidation strategy, not only vis-a-vis the United States and South Korea, but also vis-a-vis these two socialist big brothers. The Su-ryong-jae, as the backbone of the system, was supplemented by Juche ideology on the one hand, and on the other hand, centralized economic system. Literally meaning independence or self-reliance, Juche was emphasized to build ideological independence from both the Soviet Union and China. It was Kim Il-sung's alternative to the Stalinism, revisionism, and Maoism. The Su-ryong-jae was accompanied by extreme centralization of the economic system, and North Korea centralized even further and tried to build a perfect plan economy, while other socialist countries attempted loosening of the centralized economy. Despite the economic crisis since the 1990s, the North Korean system has not really changed. As Professor Cha indicated, North Korea's response to the economic crisis has been so-called military-first strategy. And the July 1st reform in the year of 2002, which was welcomed by some as the harbinger of real reform, in fact, fell far short of so-called partial reforms found in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s. And now we finally see the succession of power to the third generation of Kim's dynasty. Maybe the only significant change made is North Korea's increasing dependence on China, as shown in the ongoing process, in a succession process. But this is probably what Kim Il-sung tried to avoid throughout his life. I think this makes neo-Juche differ from the old one. Except this, the nature of the system just persists. That's why I'm pessimistic about the reformability of the North Korean system, even if there are some signs of spontaneous development of uncontrolled markets. Then what should we expect? The answer should be, I guess, the collapse of the regime. As Professor Martin Malia of Russian history argued 20 years ago, it may be the only possible, the collapse is maybe the only possible mode of change in this kind of system, which Professor Malia called at the time genetic code of non-reformability. But the problem is we cannot be sure about when and how. We only guess that the collapse is likely to come suddenly. Still, the possible paths of transitions are so complicated and full of uncertainties. I need to remind you here that both believers of totalitarianism model and revisionist pluralism model both failed to predict the collapse of communist regimes 20 years ago. I cannot introduce all the debate here, but one thing I can say is that economic failure or international pressure did not really lead to the collapse of the regime. Their collapse was just one of possible consequences of interplays of so many factors, including actors' miscalculations and even accidental ones. And, in fact, there were several modes of collapse depending on the dynamics of the critical conjunctures as well as structural and institutional legacies. So you may need to just compare the cases of the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. So you can see all kinds of transitional modes. Moreover, the North Korean elite probably learned a lot from the collapse of their colleagues in Eastern Europe. Probably they have studied extensively how to avoid misengineering of political and institutional reforms that they think the Eastern European elite committed 20 years ago. Also, the possibility of factional conflicts within the leadership or the possibility of insurgency from society also may be far less than we expect. And the North Korean leadership would not trade their nuclear program for economic assistance, as they consider it the only available and the most reliable resource for regime survival. Additionally, continuing our discourses from the morning, I think I need to highlight the geopolitical factors again here. Probably China and Russia will not let North Korea simply collapse and be observed by the South Korea. They will not tolerate the U.S. missiles stationed on the Korean Peninsula, targeting them after the unification. The China factor should be stressed even further. As Professor Lozman said in the morning, for the past few years, China has become increasingly assertive and sometimes even employs quite aggressive bilateral diplomacy. China not only has gradually increased its influence over the peninsula since the beginning of the six-party talks, but also now seems to have decided to play a more active role as the patron of the North Korea. So we now see in Northeast Asia, China exercise initiative and Russia following the suit. Given this background, even if Kim's family is overthrown, collapse, the North Korean elite or the new leadership, including the military leaders, are more likely to choose to go further under the Chinese umbrella instead of bargaining with or asking favors on the part of the U.S. and South Korea. Maybe this is sort of a realist perception in which relative power and threats are considered more important than shared pragmatic ideas and values stressed by Professor Cha. I'm not myself a realist student of international relations, but I think we need to avoid wishful thinking regarding the issue of unification via collapse. Instead, we need to examine possible contingencies more comprehensively. I believe this is what constitutes the very first step of proper preparation, to use Professor Char's words. Finally, as an extension of this exercise, I'd like to ask Professor Cha about the usefulness and prospect of the six-party talk framework, which critics argues has so far largely failed. I'm asking this because now in Seoul there is some speculation going on that there might be a new round of six-party talk after G20 summit. Given that China is no longer just intermediaries, but pushes its own agenda more proactively, and North Korea has no intention of giving up the nuclear weapons, Professor Cha, what kind of changes do you think need to be made to this so-called multiple framework? I think I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments and for those questions at the close, which I'm sure we'll get back to as we go through our panel. We'll be throwing open the questions from the floor and from the web shortly, but first let me give our paper givers a chance to respond to the questions and comments raised.
Okay. Vincent, thank you very much for your questions and puzzles. On the first puzzle, I think the PRC approach to Taiwan is exceptional in the current climate, A, because Beijing believes time is on its side, B, it wants to keep Ma in power, and so it's not going to act provocatively. And I think that the policy managers concerning Taiwan are more in charge than the policy managers on other issues. On the U.S. role, are we on autopilot? First of all, I think that the Obama administration wanted to do more when it came in than it was actually able to do. I think that we still have done things like arms sales, a major one. I think we should be sort of pushing to liberalize our economic relationship with Taiwan. But I think the basic answer to your question is that we've had a long-standing preference that the more the two sides can do on their own, the better. What about the 1992 consensus and political and security negotiations, or will China insist on the one China principle? I think this remains to be seen. I think it's a dilemma for Beijing. They have certain conceptual reasons why that's important because of the nature of the talks, but it might lead to decline of popular support in Taiwan, and so democracy gives Taiwan a certain amount of leverage. On political significance of ECFA, President Ma has called this a kind of CBM, and I think that's right. I also think that certain aspects of it improve Taiwan's claim of sovereignty. What about the old idea of an interim agreement? I actually think there is a tacit understanding about no use of force, no independence. There's a danger if you tried to turn that into a formal agreement that the two sides would realize they have less in common than they think. If the DPP became rational, what would be the U.S. approach? I think it would be good for the U.S. I mean, we've all told the DPP in the late 90s, if you come to power, what's important is the policies you pursue. I expect that would continue to be the approach. On U.S. arms sales, here I think that we should continue to follow Taiwan's lead. And how Taiwan assesses the threat to it from the mainland and how it decides to meet it, that's critical for the Taipei government. It should be critical for us. What does a hopeful resolution look like? I agree with you that, at least in the abstract, some kind of confederation is a way of reconciling the quote-unquote core interests of the two sides. I also think that's a big challenge to the Chinese system, so maybe not in our lifetimes. Thanks.
So we can't hold you to that prediction because we'll all be dead.
That's right.
Victor?
Three points quickly. The first on the points about reform in North Korea. Some folks look at these recent visits by the North Korean leader to China and, visiting different plants and things, and they see this as a sign somehow that the North might be interested in some sort of reform. I think it's very clear that Chinese for a long time have been trying to push the North Koreans to do economic reform. And essentially, from the North Korean perspective, a visit to some factory in China is basically the price they pay to look like they're paying attention in order to get the support from the North that they want. Sometimes you always look for some of the core principles, and to me, the core principle in North Korea, unlike in China, is in China to get rich is glorious. In North Korea, political power is more important than money, and as long as that continues to be the way leadership in North Korea thinks, the likelihood of reform, I think, is very difficult. On the preparations that Professor Leem and was talking about in terms of unification, again, I think when we talk about sort of the changes that are happening, there's a tendency to sometimes associate this with a hardline government in South Korea now that is very focused on a much more conservative agenda. I think when it comes to inter-Korean relations, that's actually a very big misperception. It's a mistaken perception. This was the same South Korean government that just prior to the Cheonan sinking was having secret negotiations with the North about summits and about aid proposals. And it's the same government that put forward the idea of the big plan, or whatever it was called, the grand bargain at the UN General Assembly, where after that, folks both in this town and in this government were sort of asking, are these guys closet sunshine policy people? So, I think the main thing is that, it's a pragmatic realization of the situation that they're now in. And that preparation, talking, thinking about unification in the past was equated with a policy of regime collapse, right? If the Bush administration ever talked about how we need to prepare with our South Korean allies for unification, that was seen as regime collapse. That was a policy of regime collapse. And I think in today's discussion, the point is that it's not a policy of regime collapse. It's just getting prepared, which the South Koreans for 1 decade were not willing to do. I mean, at the very highest levels, they were not willing to do this. And now the Ministry of Unification actually has a task, which is to think and prepare for unification. On the future of six-party, I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago, and TJ was there too, and we had dinner that evening with the fellow who had just been named, the former six-party negotiator who had just been named as the new national security advisor in the South Korean government. And I was joking with him over drinks about how, he was basically the second ROK six-party negotiator that was promoted to national security advisor. In Japan, the six-party negotiator has basically become the senior vice foreign minister. In North Korea, the six-party negotiator Kim Gye-gwan is now the first vice minister. Basically, the only 2 countries where the six-party negotiators haven't been promoted have been the United States and China. And I don't know what that tells you, what that says. In Russia, if you go from six-party negotiator to something else, and when you do poorly, you get demoted back to six-party negotiator. The future, I think he raises, Professor Leem raises the right questions. Even if we were to get back to a round, and the rumors about post-G20 resumption to me just seem very, very designed to sell newspapers. I think they're very far-fetched at this point. There's nothing really that looks very positive. But even if you were to get back, there are lots of questions. I mean, foremost, as Professor Lim mentioned, was the question of China's role. I think I know for sure that South Koreans across the political spectrum, right, conservatives to progressives, have a very different view of China now after the Cheonan sinking, a very different view. And whether they would see China as an honest broker in its role as host of these talks, I think, is an open question. I think it's fair to say if the talks resumed, the first question that our six-party negotiator would have to deal with would be all the press with microphones right in front of their face saying, where do you think these things are actually going to lead? Right? Because, I mean, we've had them now for quite some time, and we haven't had the desired results. I think there would be a healthy degree of skepticism about what the ultimate purpose of six-party talks would be, aside from being a negotiating forum to contain a potential crisis, to keep dialogue channels open, and to contain a potential crisis. So having said that, I know that this administration here in Washington also appreciates that this is the only multilateral security forum in which the major powers of Northeast Asia are a part of. And there's something useful to that as well. So it's hard to say.
Okay, we'll take questions now from the floor. Please come up and use the microphone and identify yourself. Let's start with DJ Pompello.
Question for Victor. First, I guess, with regard to promotion from the six-party talks, I take it you mean that promotion to ambassador to Iraq is not a promotion. But more seriously, and I think it was implied in Professor Leem's comment, and that is, while there's a lot of discussion about reunification in the South, is there any kind of corresponding discussion going on in China or Russia? Because my sense is that they're going to be key players in this, and with China's deep investment in the North now, I find it hard to envision that they would let the North, collapse or whatever happens to lead to this reunification. So it seems to me that the thinking about reunification on the part of the South may be wishful thinking.
Should we take that? Yeah, that's a good one. Touché on on Iraq. In terms of regional perceptions, not me. I would have gone back to Georgetown long before that. So, in terms of regional perceptions, I think you're right on China and Russia. Let me first say that on Japan, the sort of conventional view is that Japan is opposed to unification for all these reasons having to do with historical animosity. When all these issues started coming up with North Korea and the stroke in 2008, it was actually the Japanese officially and in their unofficial capacities that were urging the United States and South Korea to have a discussion with China about these sorts of problems because they were very concerned that there was no discussion taking place. So I think that's, and that in general, I mean, if there's any country that faces a proximate threat from North Korea today, it's Japan. And I think they have very little confidence that the current process is going to in any way provide a long-term solution to that problem. So I think Japanese attitudes are much more open on unification than they have been in the past. China and Russia, particularly China, is a very different story. I think it's pretty clear that they are the country most opposed to any sort of unification on the peninsula. They have made a core strategic calculation that unification is not in China's interests. They're adhering very closely to the North Korean regime in the aftermath of the Cheonan sinking, to me, is a sign of how fragile they felt the North was. In 2006, they were willing to go along with the world community and slap sanctions on North Korea, probably because they didn't think it could have a real debilitating impact on the regime's capacity to hold itself together. And I think the fact that they've responded by drawing closely to them after the Cheonan is really less a reflection of allegiance and more their assessment that if they had slapped sanctions on, it could have been the straw that broke the camel's back. So they're in this bizarre situation that the weaker the North gets, the more they need to continue to support it. But I think even if the Chinese hold those sorts of views, this should in no way stymie or inhibit discussions among other countries about how to prepare either for immediate contingencies related to unification or long-term problems related to unification. China doesn't hold a veto over those sorts of discussions taking place. And the more that is done to reach out to China to discuss these things, the more that China could begin to hopefully have a different view about the way they view a unification of the peninsula. Now, that's a long socialization process, I admit, but it's one that needs to take place.
Okay, I think I had Garrett next, and then Gil Rosman, Mike Fonte, and Admiral McFadden.
Garrett Vanderwees, editor of Taiwan Communique. Question for Richard and by implication also for Vincent. I want to go back to Professor Friedman's earlier discussion about cooperation versus balancing and hedging and apply that to the policies of Kuomintang and DPP towards China. The Kuomintang has been doing more cooperation approach while the DPP has been doing the hedging, so to say. You have given 5 scenarios and kind of agree with Vincent that you left the most obvious one out, and that is the DPP, a realistic DPP coming to power that is doing the necessary hedging. But isn't the question a bit more what is really China's attitude and China's approach to all this? Isn't the present stabilization, the tranquility that you are talking about, really more due to the fact that China is seeing things move its way and therefore it's happier? But as soon as Taiwan moves in another way, which is perhaps more democratic, then it will act up. So in other words, shouldn't we be putting the onus for this whole situation, what's it good and bad, on Beijing's behavior? Is it really adhering to international norms and accepting its neighbors, or is it basically bullying its neighbors?
Well, I think I've been the person who's been most vocal about the destabilizing effect of China's military buildup on Taiwan's security and what the United States should do about it. I agree with China's psychology here that it believes things are going its way, and it's more willing to be accommodating to Kuomintang government than a DPP government. I think that there is a hedge in even the Kuomintang's approach. It's a question of degree. I think the underlying question is as Taiwan engages or resists China, has it done the work to strengthen itself internally and externally to provide the best defense? And we can discuss which side has done that, but I think that's the big challenge.
Okay, I think I had Gil next, but Vincent, do you want to weigh in on this point at all? Or? No. All right, Gil.
I want to ask Victor and also echo a point by Professor Leem about the danger of wishful thinking. It seems to me that part of the explanation for South Korea is their thinking right now, and the Unification Ministry in particular, is a sense of frustration, maybe hopelessness, that China is gaining the edge in North Korea. They have much less leverage, and so this is their desperate last position, and it seems to me it's parallel. Do you think it's parallel to what happened in the United States at times where we've assumed regime collapse, regime change is likely or is something that's going to happen pretty soon, rather than thinking, hey, we better talk about other scenarios that are more unappealing? And the other side of this, isn't China, with its obsession with how regimes collapse and learning the lessons of their collapse one by one, isn't it saying we have a strategy for dealing with North Korea and we're going to make sure they don't collapse, and we have a multi-pronged strategy, and there are all kinds of things there that should be taken into consideration in any such analysis?
I think for Koreans to be thinking about potential discontinuities in the North is not wishful thinking. I think wishful thinking is when you have a North Korean leader that had a stroke in 2008, that is walking around visibly crippled because of that stroke, that is trying to transfer power to a 27-year-old son, and then to pretend that everything's okay. This regime has lasted before, it's going to last again, so we shouldn't do any. That's wishful thinking. And the other thing I would say is that just because this government or any future government in the ROK is thinking about unification, that's not a policy that's distinct from regime collapse, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you're trying to collapse the regime. I mean, if they were accompanying this with different covert efforts to actually try to collapse the regime, that would be an entirely different story. But I think that this is just simply, this is not wishful thinking. This is just thinking responsibly, because I think none of us feels completely comfortable with the fact that this leader is very sick and that his son is very inexperienced. So in that sense, preparing, I don't think, is a bad thing. And I don't think it's necessarily a last-ditch effort by a Unification Ministry that's frustrated. The Unification Ministry used to spend a substantial portion of their budget on inter-Korean cooperation. Right now, there's not a lot of inter-Korean cooperation going on. So they are instead using it to work with others around the world to help them think about unification, the Germans and others around the world. So to me, that seems like it's a responsible thing to do. I wouldn't. I mean, it's not that they're hoping for collapse. They just need to prepare in case it were to happen. And again, wishful thinking would be saying that we don't need to prepare for this because it's all going to be okay.
I think Richard wanted to weigh in on this one.
I think there's an element of wishful thinking on China's part as well. I mean, it's clear they're hoping for the best, and their policies are geared towards sort of ensuring that the best happens. But there is an irreducible possibility that we're not going to have an outcome that's positive from China's point of view. And it's not clear that China is preparing for that worst, which seems a little blind at this point.
Anyone else on the panel? Mr. Professor
I'd like to briefly add a couple of things. I left Seoul in early August again, I said. But until then, I didn't really see much talks going on about the reunification issues in South Korea. In the long term, if you talk about the unification in terms of in the long term time span, then it might not be the wishful thinking. It's just a preparation. But if you are saying unification for now or tomorrow or for 2 years, then it's quite immediate issues. So, but in the latter sense, in South Korea, we don't talk much about the unification issues now. We are talking about use it in the long-term sense. Why? I think in Professor Chach's paper, he mentioned a little bit, we have enormous economic gaps between North and South, and distrust and more immediate issues of nuclear weapons and Cheonan sinking this spring. So it's not the atmosphere of talking about or promoting unification in the short-term sense. And regarding the Chinese intention, I don't know about Chinese intention, but probably China's immediate concern is about the refugee issues if the North Korea collapse. And also China has expanded its economic interest in the North. China is the only country that invests or subsidizes North Korea in the world. So probably if this stays going on for 5 or 10 years more, then probably Chinese stakes in North Korea will grow too. So then this is just rumors, but then if the North Korean regime collapses after 5 years or 7 years, then probably China will intervene, not just economically, but also with military terms, to protect their interest, not just geopolitical, but also economic interests too. So it's quite a worst scenario, actually. So that's why I caution you that we really need to examine the possible contingencies. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. I think Victor Todd had one more point on this.
Yeah, I did, because I didn't get to address Gil's question about China, and Professor Leem did that well. I would say, is China gaining an edge in North Korea? If they want to be responsible for North Korea, that's certainly, they can have that. I mean, because obviously the flip side of having that edge, there are two flip sides. The other is, as Professor Leem said, more and more as the North Koreans become more and more reliant on China, and they will become more and more reliant on China. This, revivalist ideology is not economic reform. It's mass production. It's the Chollima movement. It's all this stuff again, and the only way they can do that is with inputs from China. So they will rely more and more on China, and that will give the world even more of a perception that China has control over North Korea, which of course means that China will be responsible if North Korea does other things in the future, like a third nuclear test or miniaturizes a warhead or another act like the Cheonan. So do they really want all of that responsibility? The other downside, of course, is that they've lost a great deal of goodwill with South Korea. The one thing that's interesting to me about views in South Korea on China is that they cross the political spectrum. Right? Progressives and conservatives in South Korea now tell you that they perceive China and South Korea as having a basic conflict of interest on the peninsula, and that was not the case before the Chinese supported the North on the Cheonan sinking. China does $180 billion worth of business with South Korea. They do $1.8 billion of business with North Korea. So they are not exactly acting in their best interest in this, and these are all the costs that they are paying just to avoid a collapse of the system. So if China can have that edge if it wants to.
Michael Fonte has been very patient. We'll now get to his question.
Thank you. Mike Fonte. I'm the Washington liaison for the DPP, so I'm going to ask about the DPP. Imagine that. Under Tsai Ing-wen, the current chairperson of the DPP, I think the DPP has come to acknowledge that it made mistakes during Chen Shui-bian's period, has learned from those mistakes, understands it has to reclaim confidence with the United States, and also wants to engage China on basic material economic interaction. But the question I have is, the basic point of the DPP, as I understand it, is they want to keep all options open for the people of Taiwan for the future. That matches, it seems to me, with U.S. policy longstanding. As President Clinton put together, the assent of the people of Taiwan is integral to any resolution. The question I have is, this seems to run at variance with what I understand to be the Taiwan Affairs Office Director, I believe it is, Wang Yi's recent statements that peaceful continued development across the straits depends upon rejection of Taiwanese independence and acceptance of the 92 consensus. And there's a maldun there, right? There's a contradiction, it seems to me, between, I think, the fundamental U.S. policy and I think the fundamental DPP policy. That is, 92 consensus and rejection of Taiwan independence demands a rejection of any movement of that option. So I wonder how you look at those questions and how you think the United States might respond, because I don't think the DPP will be provocative when it comes back into power, but perceptions, as you said, of the Chinese is what comes into play here.
Right. I guess there's another aspect to this, and that is the DPP able to convince the Taiwan public that it has learned lessons from its past performance and that it is going to engage China on responsible and appropriate terms in order to sort of maintain and continue the gains that the majority of the public believes have occurred. If they're able to do that, I learned a long time ago, don't ask hypothetical questions, but I think that puts the U.S. approach to your contradiction in a different light, because there will have been, one can infer, support for that approach. It then puts something of the onus on China. If it sort of believes that an important variable here is the hearts and minds of the Taiwan people, and the people of Taiwan have voted their hearts and minds in a way that brings the DPP back to power, then what are they going to do?
Vincent, do you want to weigh on that?
I want to go back to Richard's earlier point about successive U.S. governments emphasizing the peaceful resolution of the dispute, emphasizing on process. So, yes, conceptually, all the options should be open, right? And that also includes a theoretical possibility if, say, future leadership of the PRC, of course, more enlightened leadership, might entertain some possibility with Taiwan maintaining its identity, in autonomy, independence, and so on. But it's not clear from the current. It's not that case with the current leadership. Earlier, I posed a question: is this the gradualism toward nowhere? Obviously not. The Chinese see this as the peaceful development as a prelude, although it can be a very long prelude to peaceful unification. So the ultimate objective is not in question, but the Chinese so treasure the current low in the relationship that they are willing to wait for a long period of time, perhaps very long, But of course, the danger that Richard mentioned still exists. That one day they might lose patience. So I think that but then I also see that because the CCP is very afraid of DPP coming back to power again. That is why it's acting on fear rather than hope. So this is going to somehow limit the effectiveness of its current policy, because especially in areas that are more difficult, such as Taiwan's international participation and military deployment. So I guess that if the DPP comes back to power, it's not the Beijing should not just say that the sky is falling. They have dealt with the DPP before, and if by your reasoning that if the second timer DPP is going to be more rational, it's actually an improvement for the CCP in terms of the partner to deal with.
To the chair for a moment here. As always, I find Richard quite persuasive, thorough, and balanced, and all that. But let me just ask about the stability of stabilization. You've listed some of the threats. I want to get your reaction to some of the other possible threats. One is cross-strait relations are something like a shark. If they don't keep moving forward, they die. And one of the things about easy first, hard later is you start working through the easy issues. So is not that the tougher set of political issues not all that far over the horizon, perhaps. Secondly, what does it mean if Gil Rosman and others are right that China may be engaged in a reevaluation of the U.S. That may take less seriously U.S. power? They may really be convinced that the sort of more aggressive stance, they can push back harder against the U.S. because, of course, the U.S. backing has long been a source of this kind of stability and confidence in Taiwan. Thirdly, can the disjunction between the tone China has struck on other issues and the tone that it has struck on Taiwan issues be maintained? Is there not some risk that people on Taiwan will start saying, hey, wait a minute, we have less reason to believe the nice tone here if China is being elsewhere somewhat more aggressive? Does that not bleed in? And finally, picking up on the point about the DPP possibly returning to power, there is one possible scenario that has a signal of a possible DPP return to power long before the DPP is in a position firmly to convince China of its goodwill. Here I'm thinking of the possibility of the DPP outperforming expectations in the 5 capital elections, which then puts people in power but doesn't really have them making policy, but may raise, again, on the mainland, serious doubts about Ma's prospects for re-election in 2012.
I don't know how fast political talks will come. It will likely depend on an assessment both by Beijing and the government in Taipei of what the traffic will bear. I hope it will come after a period of discussion and exchanges, perhaps at the Track 2 level, on some of the substantive issues that could become obstacles in political talks. I think the expectation is that the next time the possibility of political talks will emerge is after the inauguration of Ma for a second term, if he does get elected for a second term. What if China underestimates the United States? That could be a problem. I think the more important is what if China underestimates or misreads the public mood in Taiwan and assumes that trends there are more favorable than they think. I don't know about the sort of maintaining sort of different discourse to one and the other. I suppose it depends on who in Taiwan is listening, and different people will hear different things. I think on the 5 cities elections, what's important is not how many of these mayorships the DPP gets, but what's its aggregate vote? Is it over 50%? Is it 49 or 45? I think that will be read in China as the better indicator of where opinion is and what is Ma's future.
I had Adam McFadden for the next question.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I'm reminded of the Chinese six-party talk person I know who got to spend a year at Stanford before moving on to retirement. I guess when I see him next, I can say, well, I could have sent him through Iran. I've thought about the issue of Taiwan being in the hands of the PLA. And now I find two people I respect a lot, you and Andy Marshall, who arrive at a different conclusion. When I look at today's weapon systems with their range and endurance and capability of systems and so forth, I've kind of thought is that 150 miles not mattering very much. Yet you called it a strategic outpost if they got it. I appreciate if you'd embellish on that a little bit. Maybe persuade me that there's some, I'm not saying there's no significance to it, but I find it, I'm wondering just what they can do with it that they can't do without it, because they can do a lot without it with the forces they have now. Victor, is there no hope for transforming North Korea? I know there are a lot of pipe dreams around, like Andrei Lonkoff and Susan Shirk and so forth. I hear reports of, there are actually news reports being sneaked out to Japan and South Korea. Is there any hope of establishing credible contact with whoever might be in the new government? Do we give up on that completely, or do we at least try? And one other thing on the Chinese-Korean viewpoint. The Chinese convinced me, whether they want unification or not, that they didn't want to be seen as an obstacle to unification. That they had to be careful about that at least. And they certainly convinced me that they didn't want to be held responsible for all the problems that North Korea might develop. Do you think either of those things are changing? Has there actually been a sea change in attitude on those terribly important points for them?
Eric, I think I said China might be more willing to act if it saw Taiwan as a strategic outpost. And obviously they would have to go through the same kind of assessments that you've gone through of what can we do with Taiwan that we can't do already. I would, first of all, recommend a book that Alan Wachman has done on how Chinese view the geopolitical value of the island of Taiwan. There's actually a long tradition of seeing it that way. And it may be that Taiwan's value, geopolitical value, would be seen not in terms of how that changes ranges of weapon systems, but the way it changes calculations of the United States and others in the region.
I would agree with that point, yeah.
There, from an operational point of view, it may facilitate the PLA Navy sort of moving into the open waters of the Pacific with less concern than they otherwise might feel.
Is transformation possible? Of this current regime in this system, I don't think so.
Do we give up on it and try?
No, but economic cooperation is possible with North Korea. With the current system and with the future system, economic cooperation is possible. But my own view is it's not the kind of cooperation that's going to transform the system. And we have plenty of evidence of economic cooperation with North Korea. I mean, Kaesong Industrial Complex, Kumgang Tourism Project, these are examples of cooperation. But in every case, the cooperation, and people who are not political scientists but economists will tell you that the sort of cooperation they want is, in sort of simplest terms, money that you give to the central government. That's economic cooperation. So you can have economic cooperation projects that may look like the North is trying to open up, but in the end, they have to meet this final condition, which is money given to the central government. And if you look at every project that they've been involved in, that's what it's been. It's been money given to the central government. So, no, I don't think that means we give up. I don't think that means that diplomats should stop negotiating because, what we also know is that the North is also prone to outbursts, nuclear tests, missile tests, and now limited conventional acts of war in the Cheonan. And that's something you have to deal with somehow. And we, for whatever reason, have not been able to deter it. We don't know how to deter a nuclear test. We don't know how to deter another missile test. And we don't know how to deter another limited act of conventional war. We just haven't been able to do these things. So, negotiating and keeping the channel open, diplomats will tell you, is the way that you try to prevent them from doing these sorts of things. Your two metrics for China are very interesting. They don't want to be seen as an obstacle to unification, and they don't want to be seen as responsible for North Korean behavior. I mean, at least based on what I've heard from South Koreans, that is exactly the path that China is on right now, being seen as an obstacle and being seen as primarily responsible for North Korean behavior.
Yes.
It's enabling.
Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Hopkins, Army Directed Studies Office. I have a question for Dr. Cha. You don't get a break today. You so eloquently explained all the costs that China is paying for being against unification. Supposing that in some other world, South Korea's new version of unification that you described that was more idea-based and not necessarily from collapse or war were to occur, is there anything that could change China's calculus to not try and prevent that?
Well, I think the first step in that regard is that the South Koreans and the Chinese need to have a discussion about unification, because I think this is the U.S. view too. I think if it's properly prepared for and talked about among countries in the region, this could be the biggest positive-sum game in Asia. I mean, since the end of the Second World War. But without adequate consultations and discussion and things, it could be the biggest zero-sum game. And the first thing that I think all the parties, U.S., ROK, China, need to do is just sit down together and talk about, and if something were to happen in North Korea, just talk about what your biggest insecurities are. I mean, that's the best way to start a discussion. Are the Chinese worried about the U.S. moving too quickly? Are we worried about the Chinese moving too quickly? Is everybody worried about the South Koreans moving too quickly? I mean, this is the sort of discussion that needs to take place. And it's not. I mean, it's certainly not happening at the Track 1 level. It happens in drips and drabs at the Track 2 level. But if North Korea were to collapse tomorrow and we had chaos because nobody knew what was going on, historians would look back and say, how could nobody have prepared for this, especially since we've known since the famine in the 1990s that this regime is terribly unstable.
Victor, all of that is so self-evident. Why do you think China is resisting this?
Well, I think because their short-term calculations override their longer-term ones, which is why I think that they probably in their decision, and it was probably a very difficult one to support the North after the Cheonan sinking, was in large part because they were more concerned that sanctions would collapse the system than it would teach them any lessons in terms of behavior. And so I think maybe their short-term calculations have really taken precedent.
We have a question for Dr. Bush from Dalton Lynn, University of Wisconsin. Will domestic politics in China affect the probability of each of the cross-strait scenarios you suggest? If so, if no, why not? And if yes, how?
I think it probably will, but how it does is hard for me to spin out. I think that Chinese public opinion is more likely to play a role if the United States is perceived to be sort of mischievously interfering in the process that is going on. or if there's a perception that leaders in Taiwan are acting in ways that are contrary to U.S. interests. I would guess that there's tolerance of the current approach, but if it goes to one of my more negative scenarios, then it probably sort of makes it harder for the Chinese leadership to sort of manage the politics within China.
Would anyone else care to weigh in on any of the recent set of questions? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, one at the back.
Maybe for you.
This question is for Professor Victor Cha, and I apologize if somebody already asked the same question earlier in the session. But in the long term, what do you see are the prospects for conflict between China and North Korea on the two key issues of North Korea's unwillingness to follow Chinese-style reform and opening, and two, to denuclearize, given that these seem to be the two key objectives of China, which directly contradict North Korea's current strategy towards of self-reliance and maintaining its nuclear ambitions. Thank you.
Well, I think those are completely in harmony with North Korea's stated objectives, right? Their stated objectives have also been that they would like to see the last dying wish of Kim Il-sung was they'd like to see a Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons. So I think in terms of stated objectives, there's not a whole lot of difference. I don't think, while I think China has more and more material influence on North Korea, I don't think they feel that they're in a position to use it, or even if they used it, they may not shape behavior, they may just collapse the regime. So if you're faced with those sorts of options, then I think you're pretty much stuck supporting the regime as they have been supporting it. The notion that there would be conflict between the two countries, armed or otherwise, is hard for me to imagine in the current situation. I guess one could always devise a scenario in which there could be some sort of open conflict, but it's hard to imagine in the current circumstances.
Just to add, although denuclearization is China's stated objective, I'm not sure they're serious anymore about it.
Yeah. I think we are approaching the very last moment here, so with apologies to those still in the questioning queue. Ordinarily at this point in our schedule for an FPRI conference, we'd have 5 or 10 minutes scheduled for a sum-up, which Harvey would give in a witty, concise, and cogent manner. Since he's not here, and Alan correctly surmised that I wouldn't be able to do that, that portion of our program has been omitted. So I will simply close things with a special thanks to the 4 members of this panel, and thanks to all panelists and all guests today for coming and participating in what I think was a lively and informative discussion. Thank you all.